They never asked for attention. They never chased hashtags or followers. Yet, quietly, they became the bridge between two worlds. The world that remembered life before the internet, and the one that can't imagine living without it. This is Generation X, the invisible generation. Born between chaos and change, between analog childhoods and digital adulthoods, they carry something no algorithm can measure. A deep, silent fatigue. The kind that comes from holding too much for too long. But who are they really? Why do so many of them feel unseen, even by history itself? And what happens when a generation that built resilience through silence finally starts to speak? You see, Gen X was raised by parents who told them not to cry, who said, "Be tough, deal with it, life's not fair." So they did. They learned to survive, not to complain, to work, not to demand, to feel, but only in private. They became the forgotten middle child of history, too young to enjoy the stability their parents had, too old to adapt as effortlessly as the generations that followed. And yet, without them, everything we know today, the digital revolution, the rise of individuality, even the very idea of balance between work and life, might never have existed. But here's the paradox that no one talks about. They built the modern world, and then quietly faded into its background. When you look at their faces, you'll notice something strange, a quiet calm that almost feels like strength. But beneath it, there's a constant hum of exhaustion, a tension between pride and loss, between nostalgia and numbness. They remember a time when you had to call someone to hear their voice, not just text. When you waited days for film to be developed just to see how you looked. When privacy was real. When offline meant peace, not fear of missing out. But now, they scroll through feeds built by the generations that came after, algorithms shaped by the children they raised, and sometimes, when they pause for a second too long, they realize the world they built no longer remembers them. They're the generation that grew up watching their parents fight for survival, and their children fight for visibility. And somewhere between those battles, they lost their own reflection. What does that do to the human mind? To grow up learning independence as a shield, and silence as love. To be told you could have it all, but also that you should never ask for help? To be the generation that learned to adapt until it no longer knew who it was adapting for? There's something haunting about it, because beneath their calm surface, many Gen Xers carry invisible grief. Not for something they lost, but for something they never had the time to feel. And yet, they rarely talk about it, because talking about it would mean admitting how much they sacrificed, and for whom. They were the first generation to live both before and after everything changed. Before technology connected the world, and before that connection made everyone feel lonelier, before mental health was a trend, before self-care was a product, back when you had to survive your emotions, not express them. So they became experts in emotional minimalism. They didn't post quotes about healing. They just tried to stay functional. They didn't call it trauma, they called it life. But here's the cruel irony. That same strength that helped them endure is now the same thing keeping them from healing. Because when you're raised to never depend on anyone, how do you learn to ask for help? When your worth was built on being reliable, how do you admit you're breaking inside? And when your entire generation has been labeled resilient, independent, low maintenance, how do you tell the world that those words were just polite ways of saying ignored? If millennials are the generation of expression and Gen Z is the generation of awareness, then Gen X is the generation of endurance. They endured emotional neglect, social transformation, and identity loss, and did it all quietly while keeping everything running. But endurance isn't the same as peace, and silence isn't the same as healing. That's where our story begins, with a generation caught between eras, still searching for a language to describe what they've been through. Because behind every quiet Gen X adult, behind every calm smile, steady job, and "I'm fine," there's a mind that's been whispering for decades. What about me? Imagine a generation that's always been caught in the middle, not the youngest, not the oldest, just stuck. This is Generation X, and for decades they've carried a secret burden, the weight of responsibility paired with invisibility. Meet Karen. She's 52, works 2 jobs, raises her teenage kids, and somehow finds time to care for her aging parents. She is, by every measure, a success. But at night, when the house is quiet, she sits alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone at all, sees her struggle. Or Michael, 48, who built a thriving career in tech, the kind of job that promised security and stability, but his friendships are fading, and he often finds himself scrolling past social media photos of people his age living carefree lives he never had the chance to enjoy. He wonders, did all those late nights at work and silent sacrifices even matter? And then there's Lisa, 55, who grew up told, "Don't make a fuss. Be independent. Life isn't fair." She carries the scars of emotional neglect and learned self-reliance so deeply that asking for help feels like betrayal. She smiles, she works, she functions. Yet inside, a quiet storm brews. These are not just individuals. They are the reflection of an entire generation, and their struggle is universal. The conflict is not just external, it is deeply internal. Gen X faces a paradox that no other generation has experienced in quite the same way. They were taught resilience, yet resilience came at the cost of visibility. They were taught independence, yet independence became isolation. They learned to endure, but endurance left them emotionally exhausted, and the world rarely noticed. While boomers fought for security and millennials fought for identity, Generation X fought to exist in the shadows. They were never the headline, rarely the focus. They were the middle layer, the quiet builders, the invisible scaffolding holding the societal structure together. And scaffolding by nature is meant to be hidden. But here's the twist. Invisibility breeds conflict. When no one sees your pain, the pain doesn't vanish. It simmers. It manifests in subtle ways. Anxiety that creeps up in the middle of the night. Emotional detachment that isolates friends and family. Chronic fatigue that cannot be explained by sleep alone. They are a generation of silent warriors, yet the battlefield is entirely internal. Take Michael again. At work, he's competent, admired, even envied. At home, he feels like a ghost. His kids see a parent, but not a person. His spouse sees a partner, but not the hidden weight of decades of deferred dreams and quiet sacrifices. And Michael wonders, did I live for myself or just for everyone else? And Karen, she tries to be strong, always strong, but strength has its limits. The endless cycle of responsibility, children, aging parents, demanding careers, leaves her questioning whether her sacrifices ever truly matter. In quiet moments, she feels guilt, not because she has failed anyone, but because she cannot find herself in the midst of giving everything. Lisa, meanwhile, feels trapped in a paradoxical cage of her own making. Her self-reliance was forged as armor, but armor, no matter how strong, can become a prison. She wants to connect, to ask for help, to be seen. Yet every instinct screams, you can't rely on anyone, you must endure. And so, silence becomes survival. This is the psychological battleground of Generation X, between duty and desire, between endurance and expression, between who they became and who they wanted to be. And then comes the external pressure. Technology, once a tool, now a mirror, reflects back what they never had. Social media is a constant reminder of opportunities missed, connections lost, experiences they were too busy to enjoy. Every post of a carefree friend, every viral success story, every celebration of life they missed while being responsible becomes a quiet knife. It's not just nostalgia, it's dissonance, a cognitive and emotional tension between past and present, between the life they built and the life they wanted. And yet, Generation X doesn't typically vocalize this tension because admitting it feels like weakness, and weakness, they were taught, is unacceptable. But the truth is, weakness is human, and the cumulative weight of decades of being strong is beginning to break through the cracks. Consider the workplace. A Gen Xer may be admired for competence, but colleagues often overlook their burnout. They are relied upon but rarely supported. Mentors to younger generations, guides to the inexperienced, yet when they stumble, the system offers little help. Recognition is rare, acknowledgement scarcer. The emotional calculus is simple: give endlessly, receive quietly. At home, the conflict continues. Gen X parents want to provide stability for their children, but parenting in the digital age is a maze they were never trained to navigate. Boundaries that once seemed simple, phone usage, internet safety, emotional check-ins, are now relentless puzzles, generating stress that few outside the generation fully understand. Even friendships are fraught with hidden tension. Lifelong friends drift away, consumed by their own lives. Connections that once offered solace now require effort that exhaustion often cannot provide. And so, a quiet loneliness settles in, sometimes unnoticed even by the person experiencing it, the kind that comes from perpetual invisibility, not absence. And here lies the central question of conflict. What do you do when your strength becomes your prison? When the very traits that carried you through life now isolate you? When the world you helped build leaves you in the shadows? Generation X is facing a crisis of recognition, a battle of identity, a test of whether endurance alone is enough to survive, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Yet, they are still fighting. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet moments when they choose to keep going, despite exhaustion. When they decide, day after day, to love without expectation, to provide without gratitude, to be invisible yet essential. And that quiet struggle is profoundly human. So here's the challenge: the internal and external conflict that shapes the Gen X experience. How do you reconcile decades of silent sacrifice with the need for acknowledgement? How do you honor the past while adapting to a world that barely pauses to notice you? How do you survive when survival itself has come at the cost of seeing yourself? These are not abstract questions, they are lived realities. They shape careers, relationships, mental health, and self-perception. And as the generation reaches the midpoint of life, these questions intensify. The body shows the wear of years, the mind recalls the choices made and unmade, and the heart quietly asks, did I live enough for myself? Did I matter? This is the conflict Generation X lives every day. Between responsibility and recognition, endurance and expression, silence and the desperate need to be seen. It is a struggle invisible to the world, yet deeply visible to those living it. And it is only the beginning. Because once the quiet cracks appear, once the weight becomes too heavy to carry silently, everything changes. The stage is set for a rising tension, for decisions that challenge decades of learned behavior, for revelations that shake foundations, for emotional truths that cannot remain hidden any longer. Generation X stands at a crossroads, and the choices they make next will define not just their own future, but the legacy of every silent sacrifice, every unspoken struggle, every unseen act of endurance that brought the world to where it is today. The quiet endurance of Generation X has always been their secret weapon, until it wasn't. Picture Michael again. One late night, alone in his apartment, the weight of decades crashes down, emails unanswered, bills piling up, a career built on diligence that now feels hollow. He stares at the ceiling, and for the first time, he admits, I don't even recognize who I am anymore. It is here, in these moments of quiet desperation, that the tension begins to rise. The world outside continues, loud, fast, and demanding. But inside, everything slows down. Every missed opportunity, every unspoken need, every silent compromise comes rushing back. The clock ticking on the wall becomes a drum of regret. Karen's conflict escalates differently. She wakes to the phone ringing at dawn, her mother needing help, her children asking questions she doesn't have the energy to answer. Her day stretches endlessly. And yet, even in the middle of chaos, a new thought creeps in. Am I living or just surviving? And Lisa? Her breaking point is subtler, but no less dramatic. She sits in a nearly empty house, the echoes of years of self-reliance bouncing back at her. She remembers the times she held back tears to comfort others, the moments she swallowed frustration to avoid conflict, the nights she went to bed feeling invisible. And in that silence, she finally hears the question she's been denying. Who am I, if not the person everyone expects me to be? These are the fractures forming under pressure. Every decision they made to protect, endure, and provide now confronts them with a painful truth. Enduring silently comes at a cost that cannot be ignored. But the tension doesn't remain internal. Life finds ways to force exposure. Michael faces a sudden career shakeup, a project failure that puts him on the edge of losing what he's worked for decades to achieve. The familiar confidence he built over years collapses. Anxiety creeps in, not just professionally, but personally. The relationships he neglected to preserve are now strained. Every friend he once considered unbreakable feels distant. And Michael wonders helplessly, was my sacrifice worth this? Karen faces a crisis in her family. Her father falls ill suddenly, requiring more care than she anticipated. Her children, sensing her fatigue, begin to rebel in small, painful ways. The delicate balance she held so carefully for years begins to crumble. She feels the raw edges of her humanity, long smoothed over by endless responsibility. Lisa confronts the most painful reality of all: emotional isolation. A lifelong friend moves away. Another drifts into a life so different it feels like a betrayal. She finally faces herself in the mirror. Decades of strength and independence have left her alone in ways she never anticipated. This is the breaking point. It is not dramatic in the way movies show. There is no sudden explosion, no public collapse. It is quieter, but infinitely more devastating. It is the slow, suffocating realization that enduring, sacrificing, and staying silent cannot fill the void inside. And yet, even here, there is a spark of hope, because the very awareness of the breaking point creates a new choice. Michael picks up the phone tentatively and calls a colleague for guidance. Not prideful, not demanding, just asking. The act itself is small, almost invisible, but monumental for someone who spent decades believing that dependence equals weakness. Karen asks her children to help around the house in ways she never allowed before. She admits, in words trembling with vulnerability, that she cannot do everything alone. And suddenly, the weight she carried for years begins to lift, ever so slightly. Lisa reaches out to a friend, not expecting perfection, not expecting immediate connection, but seeking human contact, authentic, messy, and real. And for the first time in decades, she feels seen, even if only for a moment. This is the emotional resolution. Generation X learns, at last, that endurance alone is not enough. That strength without acknowledgement, sacrifice without reflection, and silence without expression can no longer sustain them. The lesson is not new. It has always been whispered in psychology books, in therapy sessions, in quiet moments of self-reflection. But only now does it hit with clarity. Asking for help is not weakness. Vulnerability is not failure. Being human is enough. It is here, in these subtle but profound shifts, that they begin to reconcile decades of sacrifice with the need for recognition. They are no longer invisible scaffolding. They are architects of their own emotional world, finally allowed to admit the weight they carried and take steps to lighten it. And the moral is clear. Life is not a test of endurance alone. Strength is not the absence of vulnerability. The lessons Generation X has learned in silence, patience, resilience, loyalty, adaptability, are valuable, but only when paired with self-compassion, expression, and connection. By choosing to break their silence, Gen X shows us all something crucial. The human mind thrives not in invisibility, but in authentic engagement. The heart survives not by constant giving, but by occasional receiving. And the soul flourishes not in isolation, but in the acknowledgement that we are seen, valued, and understood. So the story ends not with despair, but with a quiet triumph. Not with fireworks, but with the profound relief of finally exhaling decades of unspoken tension. Michael reconnects, Karen rests, Lisa smiles through tears, and the world, slowly, subtly, gently, begins to notice the generation that never asked to be seen, but whose endurance built the bridge to the future. Generation X reminds us that being human is complex, that strength is nuanced, that life is a balance between giving and receiving, surviving and thriving, enduring and expressing. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truths, and when those truths are finally acknowledged, the world is better for it.